Well, hello and welcome to the end of year planning. 4 tips to hit the ground running in 2023. I'm joined today by an illustrious group, Dan Mallard and Patrick Maese. Gentlemen, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Ryan.
Excited about today's webisode. Let's get into it. What is the IronEdge methodology for client success?
So I'll jump in here. So we're account managers, both Dan and myself, and we work with our clients typically at the end of the year to start looking forward to the next either fiscal or calendar year for their project initiatives. And so in that process, what we'll typically do is we'll sit down and we'll look at what initiatives they have. Really what sort of starts the conversation is looking at their current infrastructure. So their infrastructure will consist of hardware like servers, switches, firewalls, really everything that sort of runs the organization's network and IT environment, right? And in that vein, what we typically look at is the age of the infrastructure, because that's really a red herring with regards to what you would need to do to plan for the next steps of the organization. So in general, most hardware has kind of a lifespan around the 5-year mark. That's generally the for network and server equipment. And that really comes back to power supplies and moving pieces. Those parts in those pieces of equipment are the ones that tend to fail at that age, right? And so when we purchase new equipment, we usually get them with a 3-year support and warranty contract. And that 3-year mark is a great time to pause and look to see what the organization has plans to do in the future. So typically what we look at is we'll purchase a piece of equipment, have a 3-year warranty and support contract applied to it. And then when that 3-year mark comes around, we'll sit down and say, okay, is this hardware sized appropriately for your organization? Does it serve the purposes of your company? And if it does, typically we'll extend out the support contract for another year or two. But really beyond that 5-year mark is when we really look to replace that or really understand if that is the right solution for the next 3 to 5 years. Because when you're purchasing equipment, you're really purchasing it for the future, and you're trying to base your sizing and the resources of that equipment for the next 3 to 5 years. And it could very well be that you have a server that's 5 years old, it's getting aged out, you need to replace it. At that point, you sit down and you're like, okay, well, do we want to get a new server? Does that make sense to the organization? Do we want to replace it like for like? Do we want to move to the cloud? A lot of organizations have started that process, and if not already in the cloud, and maybe this piece of equipment that you have doesn't make sense for your organization. So a lot of these sort of questions start coming up as we're starting to look towards replacing or refreshing a lot of that infrastructure.
Yeah. And so Dan, on your side, do you see that the hardware lifecycle management is the driver of the technology methodology for an organization?
So I'd say partially. When I go into these meetings, I'm really thinking of 3 things. I'm trying to by looking at what's in place and then planning out the future, you want to ensure operations are smooth so people have equipment that works. You want to make sure that the current threat landscape and potential threat landscape in the future, that you have good security posturing against all of that. And then third, what I want to look at is I want to be able to give the client a predictable budget so they have a successful financial year the following year where they can budget most of their IT spend. So I'm trying to do those 3 things. So really, those are the things that I'm trying to address in ours, and Patrick does too. We do it in the same way. But that's really the main drivers. I want to attack those 3 things, and really everything else kind of falls into place once I consider those things. So from a hardware replacement standpoint, I'm trying to predict future spend. I want to make sure operations are smooth so people can work. and I want to make sure people are secure. And so,
and those become collaborative conversations with
Without a doubt.
customers in our kind of
Mhm.
virtual CIO roles, where it's like, where is the organization going, and does the current hardware get you there? Does the current infrastructure get you there? Patrick brought up a great point of, as more workloads move to the cloud, the hardware budget can change. That the life cycle of equipment purchase, which I thought it was really good, Patrick, that you said, we're buying hardware for the future use.
Right.
When we buy net new, we're buying for the future. We're kind of looking out because we don't want that spend to be wasted. So I can see how all of that ties together in looking at both hardware lifecycle management, where the applications are going as far as what business line applications run the company. Because one of the things that I've noticed over the last few years is every company is a technology company now, whether they like it or not. They may make widgets or they may install insulation, but it still all runs on technology. And so that's just such a core piece of the business. And we learned through the pandemic that you live and die by the technology you have in place.
Yeah.
So it's critically important.
And what we've seen, there's been this big shift over the last 10 years, where 10 years ago, your big IT spend was in infrastructure and the servers and stuff you would buy. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, and especially the last 2 years, is that spend still happening, but it's shifted. So it's shifted to your network layer and keeping your network up and your internet services up and being very resilient and secure. And also the cloud-based application layer. So the spend is just kind of shifted. So we've had to focus as IT professionals over the last X number of years to say, okay, how does IT work now in the cloud? How do you keep it secure? How do you keep people productive? How do you keep your environments up? As opposed to, how do we keep these servers up? How do we keep these servers backed up? How do we keep them secure? Just kind of change the focus. And that's something that we talk about annually with our clients is, looking out in the future, how can we eliminate the need for on-prem infrastructure if it's appropriate? And how can we move you into more cloud-based infrastructure that's more resilient and possibly more secure? So that's something we talk about all the time.
And I think that comes to defining the business goals, right?
Exactly
right.
Patrick,
that it's this forecasting, this future look. How do you work with clients to define these business goals here at the year end?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. So we like to say, as your applications or your line of applications go, so goes your infrastructure. Oftentimes, what we're seeing is a lot of these applications that have traditionally lived on your local server and your local environment, your ERP softwares, your accounting softwares, are moving to the cloud. They're moving to a web-based, SaaS-based model. And so you no longer have to run these applications on a server in your server room, right?
A lot of times they're not even allowing you to anymore.
Exactly.
Like they're forcing you into cloud, whether that's
right. And so when you
others.
have these line of business applications that are now out of your environment, you're really opened up to kind of start exploring and adopting more of the cloud model. And there's positives and negatives to that. Like, obviously, traditionally you're used to having this CapEx spend of like, I want to buy some equipment and I want to amortize it over the next 5 years. That moves to more a recurring model where you're paying monthly, a subscription model for all of these services. But there's positives to that, right? We won't get kind of in the cloud environment, but when we're sitting down, we're like, we need to buy a solution that fits the organization for 5 years. That's hard to aim at, right? We have to plan for a server that's going to fit the needs of the organization for the next 5 years.
And often they can't tell us what 5 years the size and scope is going to be.
And the cloud gives you that flexibility to kind of go up and down and scale. So it's a little bit more flexible than trying to guess at what the next 5 years are. So oftentimes what we'll do is, one, look at the application, see what their next few years are going to look like. Are they moving to the cloud, and start planning around that? But really understanding from the business owner's perspective, the stakeholders' perspective, what their business objectives are for the next couple of years. That's critical for IT to support those business decisions, because really IT is there to support the goals of the organization. So sitting down with the stakeholders, sitting down with the owners, understanding what their plans are, their goals are for their organization for the next 12, 24, 36 months helps us from an IT consultant standpoint put the solutions in there to support those business goals. And that's really what our objectives are.
Dan, what is your thoughts on business goals and drivers and how you're interfacing with clients on this year-end planning session streak that we're on now in Q4?
Yeah. I like a lot, everything that Patrick said. I would say that for a lot of my clients, they look at us as their IT staff because they don't have an IT staff at all. So we need to come in and be consultative as I consult with my clients and try to anticipate where their infrastructure may change or how their infrastructure may change in the next 5 years or 7 years. So with several of my clients, we've talked about the value, like Patrick talked about, the positives of having on-prem infrastructure. But then through the pandemic and just naturally over time, people have wanted more resilient infrastructure where they can work for anywhere, that they don't have to buy infrastructure anymore and all these things. So they may not know exactly what the solution will be, but my clients may say, I want to be able to work from anywhere. That's something that I want. So then our team can come in as consultants and say, okay, great. I know that you want to work from anywhere and you have these requirements. Here are ideas or directions we could go to achieve that. And so the expectation really from our side is to be that consultative voice that can come in and say, here's some solutions. Because we oftentimes when we get a new client, they'll tell us, look, our last company didn't give us very good consultative solutions. They didn't bring things to our attention. They didn't give us ideas. So a large role of the account managers here at IronEdge is to do that and to do that actively all year long. And then this end of year financial planning and budgeting effort really brings all of that together. And we say, look, here's the consultative we're bringing you. Here's the ideas. Here's possible solutions. Here's technology. And it really kind of comes together at the end of the year. And that's kind of what I do and what our really me and Patrick, our role here is at IronEdge.
Excellent. I think you jumped ahead because we were going to talk about considering these technology needs of businesses. I mean, it's topic number 3 of our top 4 lists for end of year planning. And looking at, and I'm going to reframe this question. So this is, you already kind of went down this road. What are some of the new and emerging technology needs that you're seeing in the customer base of small to medium businesses in Texas that we support? What are these technology needs that need to be budgeted for now? What are we working with clients and prospects on, hey, this is the future. This is where things are going. Are you considering this? And are you, budgeting appropriately thereof?
The big thing that I'm seeing, then I'll hand it off to Patrick for anything that may be different, is over the last couple of years, a big focus of business and business IT has been response and general adoption of cyber insurance and cyber audits. So lots of our clients are getting these cyber audits and they're saying, okay, we need to fill this out. We're not exactly sure how to fill it out. We're not even exactly sure what we have, but we need to do this. And those cyber audits are giving us a really good roadmap of what needs to be put in place from a technology security perspective. So that guides a lot of my consultative with the client. Is really our business IT managed services is kind of morphed into IT security and managed services. And what we've seen is a big shift over the last couple of years since the pandemic. Infrastructure has been attacked in different ways. And what we have done as a company is try to adopt our solution stack and to propose solutions to our clients that are appropriately secure. So IT's changed a little bit. So what I've been doing for my clients is, in addition to trying to best meet their needs as far as their application layers and anything they need to work with their application vendors, I also try to get a seat at the table and say, look, security is a big deal. Here's your cyber audit requirements list, or at least what they want you to have in place. Here's potentially other third-party investor requirements. Let's put everything you need in place in a planned, methodical way over the next couple of years to answer yes to all of these questions. Patrick, are you seeing kind of the same stuff, or is it a little bit different for you?
Yeah, and I'm going to give an example. So what we see from a technology solution standpoint, we'll take mail services as an example, right? So insurance providers will specifically ask, are you as an organization hosting or running your own mail server, an exchange server, for example? Because right away, that is a huge risk to the organization because it's a very big target for hackers, right? Like they're the ones that are targeting these sort of information systems, these mail servers, because they're easy to gain access to. So having those solutions in place from a cybersecurity standpoint is a huge risk to the organization. So when we see that and we have a mail server that's running internally, again, when it comes to a point of refresh, it's like it doesn't make sense to have that kind of system in your environment because it's too much of a risk to your organization. Everyone's adopted, a cloud mail provider, 365, those sort of products, because simply the amount of security that those providers like Microsoft have, their pockets are much deeper to apply security to those systems than a small to medium-sized business, right? So those types of solutions no longer make sense to run internally. So understanding not only what you have now, what the future holds for that information system, but how cybersecurity plays into those that decision-making process.
Seems like cybersecurity is wrapped around absolutely every decision we've been making the last 2 to 3 years. It's just nonstop barrage. And that's because the bad actors just won't go away.
Right.
Like everything we do has to be centered around, are we protected? Are we secured as to the best or to the budget ability?
Yeah, so
nonstop.
solution design, obviously we've talked about hardware refreshes, we've talked about new solutions that may make sense from a cybersecurity perspective, and why adopting new technologies makes sense from that perspective. So that's part of the planning process. One of the things that as a managed service provider that we also do is look at service metrics, right? So we use ticketing systems where the end users will submit issues to the help desk, and we have a valuable amount of business intelligence information based on that metrics, right? So oftentimes we'll sit down and we'll look at kind of the problem areas over the past 12 months to understand what's sort of the pain points from an IT support perspective. And we look at that and we're like, well, what's driving those problems? What's driving those issues? And start thinking about, well, how can we solve these with technology, right? Like we'll go back to the email conversation. If we're spending a lot of time over the past 12 months just dealing with email support issues or something along those lines, we would look at that and say, okay, well, that's consuming the support cycles. What can we do to address that need so that we're not buried under these email issues? And it could very well
adds costs, right? I mean, it adds costs on our side that then parlays into costs on the client side. These investments have to happen in order to keep the overall total cost of ownership of your IT systems in line. If you're allowing this IT debt, as I know we've called it many times before, to percolate in your organization because you're not willing to have the CapEx or the OpEx conversion into cloud, it just gets more expensive to operate. And so that, how do we budget for these new initiatives? How do we budget for this operational expense versus CapEx? How are you guys working with clients and customers today on setting these budgets in place? I know it can be hard. I've had those same conversations where it's like, we don't know, we have this initiative, we don't know how much it costs. And once we figure out how much it costs, that initiative suddenly isn't going to happen anymore.
Yeah. So we talked about hardware refreshes, software licenses, warranties, new initiatives like, projects that we want to do to address efficiency issues on the support side. So we have sort of this stack of potential things that we need to budget for the next following year. So how do you go about doing that, right? So we have a lot of industry experience so that we have kind of a ballpark idea of what some of these initiatives might look like. So oftentimes we'll come down with this list of like, here's our required things that we have to do. Like say we have to replace a server because it's 5 years old. There's no choice on that. We have to replace this one. Here are some nice to have initiatives, and we may have some wish list items like say, these are things that we would love to do, but they're certainly not a requirement. And then once we have this list, we start marking some budget dollars against that. Maybe it's a $10,000 initiative or a $20,000 initiative. One of the things that we like to do is come up with a sort of ballpark figure and then simply add 20% to that figure, because who knows what that number might be. And it's always good to budget high. And later down the next few months, if we actually do this initiative and it comes in lower, then you have the budget dollars to do it. So always budget high.
It's a fine balance though. You budget too high and then you don't do the initiative because it's going to cost this much.
Yeah.
Like it's getting within the Ryan Lakin patented 20% buffer of either direction.
I agree with that. I do the same
I mean,
thing.
you have to go within this range, but you don't want to budget so high that these initiatives don't happen at all for the business. And some of these can be game changing. Whether, and we're talking about just infrastructure, but new software, new ERP, new solutions that take the business in a new direction. Those are all things that, if it's going to come in at $250,000, maybe they don't do. But if it's $100,000, maybe that does really spark a whole new business or service line for these organizations. Dan, anything to add to these, how you go through this budget process or how you're looking at the future for your client base?
Yeah, as a super zoomed out version of it, Patrick said now a couple times the same things that I do, and we kind of obviously have the same job.
We all try to do it the same way.
We do at IronEdge. We kind of all meet on it. We all have, sort of our planning sessions on how to address this with our clients. But super zoomed out, I do exactly what Patrick does, which I look at anything that needs to be refreshed from a hardware perspective, anything that needs to be refreshed from a service perspective, and then any potential projects. And what guides those decisions and the way I address all of those is compliance, security, and anything that I've previously talked to the client about. And then I gather all that together, and oftentimes I'll present total numbers, and I'll also be able to break down per month what the estimated spend would be. So sometimes people like that, but really I get all that together, and then I'll meet with a client sort of in a pre-meeting before we meet with any other stakeholders and go, here's what we put together from the IronEdge side. What do you think? And the client will sit there with me and we'll kind of, change things around, add things, take things out, move things around the calendar. And oftentimes then my client point of contact will say, this is great. This is exactly what I need. And then probably half the time I go in with the client contact to the stakeholder meeting and I say, okay, here's what we put together. I explain it. The client point of contact explains it. And then it's normally when we've gone through all that effort, it is approved. And that's kind of guides IronEdge's focus and my focus for the next 1 to 3 years, definitely the next 1 year. But that really sets our operational plan from an IT perspective for the next 12 months as soon as that's approved. It's really, really terrific. And I believe what's been reflected back to me is our clients value that very, very much. And it's a differentiator between us and our peers.
Yeah, creating that timeline is critical because it's expectation management, which I think I know has been a core tenet of our organization since founding, but a lot of IT service providers don't really consider that having this timeline, having this expectation management of spend is important to their customer.
Yeah.
It's, nobody likes that call going, hey, by the way, your warranty renewal is up and it's $27,000 and you weren't planning on it that year.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Like I just bought this 3 years ago. It's like, yeah, well, it's been 3 years and now the warranty needs to be renewed. Like having those conversations early and often, I think is a critical component for any mature organization.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Yeah. And to Dan's point, like once you kind of go back and forth on working through the initiatives and budgets, and you finally have this sort of blessed budget approval list, then at that point, it comes back to us and we start plotting it on the next 12 to 24 months, right? So if we're doing a 12-month budget and we have this budget list of all the initiatives, at that point, we'll start plotting them into what the next year looks like. Is it a first, second, third, fourth quarter initiative? Do we want to do those specifically to certain months and start outlining the next year with those approved budgets on how and when those are going to be executed for the next 12 months. And really beyond 12 months, you might have some larger initiatives that kind of are less defined, but we know we're going to be doing those in year 2 or 3. We still have those kind of on the horizon, but they may not be very well defined. They may just have we know we need to do that in 24 months. It'll probably be X amount of dollars, but we know that we actually have beyond 12 months, somewhat of a roadmap of what needs to get done for the organization.
Well, it gets really hard to look out beyond that. I mean, if anything we've learned over the last 12 months is inflation. Anything we budgeted over a year ago out the window by 10 to 20%. I mean, thank God for the Ryan Lake and patented 20% buffer. But at the same time, I mean, it's shocking what pricing and cost and everything that's just
Or availability
keeps
for that matter.
availability, having to pivot last minute. It has been a real interesting challenge for not only our clients' budgets, but for us to be able to supply the solution. So in closing of our webisode today, any further thoughts on how to prepare for next year? We're rolling into 2023. And yes, I did just have to go look at what day it was today to get the year, because it's 2020 times 2 at this point. So any fun thoughts to share with our audience, things that you're thinking about as you roll into the end of the year today?
Yeah, I'll share this, that you may be, if you're a client point of contact and you interface with your IT managed services provider or with us, your company may be not quite mature enough that they have a formal budget, or that any of this is actually any current things that you require. But what you can do is you can come to us and you can certainly say, hey, give me an idea what we should spend this year. And we can provide that. You can start gathering that data year over year. And then at some point in the future, you may have a formal IT budget, but we should be able to provide this information and feedback and consultative support. Even if you don't have a formal budget, we can still meet with you at the end of the year and we go through all these things. One of the big values of it is once we've developed, once we come up with sort of our hardware that needs to be replaced list, right? So once we kind of understand that, you can kind of anticipate future IT needs. You can anticipate machines dying. You can anticipate these things from a productivity standpoint. And that can be very, very valuable just outside of the budgeting component. For example, say you have a fleet of 100 computers and they were all bought at the same time. And that fleet is now 5 years old. I would meet with you, even if we didn't have a budget to attend to. I'd say, look, there's an operational risk here. You have a bunch of really, really old computers, let's keep that in mind as we go through this year. So even if you're not at a point where you need a formal budget put together by your managed services provider, there's still lots of valuable information that we get out of the process that I think would benefit you.
And I think one of the biggest risks going into 2023 and all this talk of recession, this talk of economic downturn, you're seeing it in some components of the economy, but not all. Budgeting gets really hard when you don't know what the future looks like. Nobody has a crystal ball. I know I've tried to find one on eBay, but it's really difficult to work with our clients and prospects on, what are you going to do? Well, I don't know what the economy is going to look like. Okay. So you almost end up, and I know in my mind's eye and as a business owner, what I'm looking at is I've got a good, better, best. Like depending on these different levers, if something happens, okay, our budget's going to shift over here. We're going to change this down, or we're going to, increase this if this happens. And so it gets a little complicated, but it's, at least for me, it's a good practice to be like, I know everything's great. I'm at here. If things really, if the wheels fall off of the economy, we're going to go to here. You have different plans already built, because having a great plan allows you to be, organized and get things done and still accomplished.
And that was going to be my last point that you just touched on, Ryan, was the budgeting and looking towards the future is not necessarily about IT budgets, but mostly about planning, right? So what we want to try and avoid is that reactive nature of the IT world and having to just react to the issues that come up. Really, when we are able to plan and have a strategy towards IT, that makes us more efficient. That makes the business more efficient. And in turn, it makes everybody successful.
You're exactly right. And I think that by having that plan, it takes away the nomenclature of IT being a cost center. IT is a cost center because it's allowed to be reactionary, because you're not budgeting, you're not planning for the future, you're not putting this at least into some sort of workbook. And so every spend is this reactionary spend, which then gives it the whole nomenclature of being a cost center. IT should really be a solution center for the business. It really should be a value driver for the business if handled appropriately. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining us on our latest webisode about end of year planning. It is almost upon us here, this end of 2022. Who would have thunk it? It'll be 23 before we know it, or 20 times 3. There's just, who knows what's in store. But hope you all have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you much.